and we look forward to your guest lecture.
All right. So thanks for this introduction. It's nice to meet all you people, even if briefly and at great distance. What I wanted to talk about today is based on my book from 2012, which Jordan just mentioned, A User's Guide to Thought and Meaning. I realized rather late in the time, when it was almost finished, I realized why I was writing it. It was sort of my reaction to being in the philosophy department at Tufts, which I had joined in 2005. And I felt like I could not write a story in standard philosophical terms, so I had to do something more informal that got to the essence of the way I see the problem. So this is a book that's for a general audience. It's relatively non-technical. It's not very long, and it's in bite-sized chapters averaging around 5 pages, and it even has cartoons to draw to you, but I think there's still some serious philosophy of language and philosophy of mind in there. So the question I want to ask, or one of the questions I want to ask, is what's thought like? Or maybe a different question, what's it like when you're thinking? And there's a common intuition that thinking is talking to yourself. So thought is some sort of inner speech, the Joycean stream of consciousness, and it consists of verbal imagery. So we see this early on in Plato, in the dialogue, The Sophist, where the stranger says, "Are not thought and speech the same? With this exception that what is called thought is the unuttered conversation of the soul with herself." And Theaetetus, the stooge, says, "Quite true." And the stranger continues, "But the stream of thought which flows through the lips and is audible is called speech." And Theaetetus says, "True, yes, boss." Then we see this, of course, more recently in an extreme form in John B. Watson, who's one of the fathers of American behaviorism. He says, the hypothesis that all of the so-called higher thought processes go on in terms of faint reinstatements of the original muscular act, including speech here, is, I believe, a tenable one. So he thinks that thinking is moving your vocal tract, but not making a sound. Here's a philosopher, Peter Carruthers. He says, it's images of natural language sentences which are the primary vehicles of our conscious thoughts. Even my 4.5-year-old son says, I think in English. I can hear myself think. Noam Chomsky says, language is not properly regarded as a system of communication. It's a system for expressing thought, something quite different. Language use is largely to oneself, inner speech for adults, monologue for children. So here he's going sort of the other way. He's saying language is what enables us to speak. Wittgenstein says, when I think in language, there aren't meanings going through my mind in addition to the verbal expressions. The language is itself the vehicle of thought. Well, we now see this notion, the vehicle of thought in Wittgenstein and Chomsky. What's the vehicle of thought as opposed to the thought? Well, I'll try to show you this. Now, there are lots of problems with this view of thought as inner language. So Wittgenstein goes on to doubt. So he says, if you say, so you really wanted to say, one is tempted to use the following picture. What he really wanted to say, what he meant, was already present somewhere in his mind, even before we gave it expression. That implies that there's some sort of meaning or thought independent of the language. And consider, if the thought is the same as the linguistic expression, how is it possible that we can translate even roughly between languages? And then also, what are we saying when we say two sentences mean the same thing? If we say the lion chased the bear and the bear chased the lion mean the same thing, at least approximately, how could they? They're different sentences. Another issue is, how could animals think if you need language to think? And animals do think, I believe. We'll come back to that point later. And there's a different intuition that's implied in Chomsky's quote, that language expresses thought. The thought is something different from the language that expresses it. But now, then the question is, what is the thought that language is expressing? And to address this question, I want to dig a little deeper and ask, what's language such that it can express thought? More specifically, what are words? What are sentences? And so on. Now, words and sentences wouldn't exist if there weren't people using them. I think that's the fundamental argument for mentalism in theories of language and thought. And my way of putting the question is, what's going on in people when they use words and sentences, when they speak or understand words and sentences? And I call this in the book, I call this the cognitive perspective. We're sort of looking inside the head of language use. So what's a word? A word involves a linkage in a speaker's long-term memory between a pronunciation or a phonology, a phonetics, which is a coding of what the word sounds like and how to produce it. And it's a linkage between that and a concept, which is the word's meaning. So I'm going to have to ask, well, what's a concept? Well, I think it's best to approach the question of what's a concept by asking what a concept has to be able to do. Besides being able to be expressed in language, a concept basically has to do two other things. The first one is reference, the referential function. The referential function allows you to point to things in the environment, categorize them in the environment, and say, this is a chair, that thing isn't. Though notice, I want you to notice that there's no direct connection between your concept of a chair and chairs in the environment. You have to perceive an object. You have to encode it in your working memory in order to even see that it's there, much less to compare it to the concept. The other major function of concepts is to characterize inference. So a concept allows you to make inferences. If something is a chair, it looks sort of like this. You can sit on it and so on. If it's a dog, it does such and such. It likes such and such. If it's a sandwich, you can eat it, and so on. And inferences are even involved with things that you see. That is, you make the inference that if I were to turn around, I would have a back. I wouldn't be a hollow shell. I think this is Helmholtz's notion of vision as unconscious inference. You generate beliefs about what you're seeing in vision that go beyond what's presented directly. And all the inferential patterns among concepts have to be stored in memory in terms of relations among them. So this pattern is often called a semantic network. So a word, again, is a linkage of a pronunciation or a phonology stored in memory, and a concept that's also stored in memory. These two poles of words can exist independently. So a nonsense syllable like thit or squig has a pronunciation that's not linked to a concept. That's what makes it nonsense syllable. On the other side, there's what have sometimes been called sniglets. These are concepts that are not linked to a pronunciation. So things that you don't have a word for, but you recognize. In America, we have this concept or this thing that's the strip of lawn between the sidewalk and the street. I don't have a word for this. My wife calls it an esplanade, and I say, that's ridiculous. That's not his name. She says, sure it is. Okay, for me, before I was exposed to my wife's word, this was a concept that I recognized. I had to push the lawnmower over this piece of lawn, but I didn't have a word for it. So now what's a sentence? Well, a sentence is also a linkage of a pronunciation and a meaning in a speaker's head. Typically, sentences are not memorized, unlike words, so this linkage has to be established in working memory. The pronunciation of a sentence is made up of the pronunciations of the words in the sentence and in an linear order that's according to the grammatical patterns of the language. The meaning of the sentence is made up of the meanings of the words in the sentence, what you might call the Phrygian interpretation. But in addition, there's other stuff, pieces of meaning that don't come from the words. What kind of other stuff do I mean? Well, they're pieces of meaning like these. If somebody says, I'm parked out back, I've understood it in my car. Is there something going on in there? Somebody's ought to be switched off.
I think we removed it. I asked.
Okay. Okay, good. So if I say I'm parked out back, that is understood to be my car, but I haven't mentioned car. Or the famous example from Jeff Nunberg, where a waitress says, the ham sandwich in the corner wants some coffee. The ham sandwich means the guy with the ham sandwich, the person who ordered or who is eating the ham sandwich. Or my wife says to me, will you be going by a mailbox? And what she really means is, would you mail some letters for me? So this is the other stuff of meaning that goes beyond what is actually said. Another example is an elliptical sentence. Here's two examples that have only one word, the same word, but you still get the intended meaning, which is obviously different for the two utterances. In the first one, it means don't kiss me. The second is don't step off the roof. Now, we want to say two sentences mean the same if they express the same complex concept, either within the same language, the bear and the lion, or in different languages. Again, the meaning of a sentence has referential properties. It pertains or purports to pertain to some situation in the environment, and it has inferential properties. So one can draw conclusions or perform actions or assert further sentences based on the meaning of a sentence. So now I've articulated language into a sound component, its pronunciation or phonology, linked to a conceptual component, namely the meaning, where meaning is the mental structure in terms of which thought takes place. Now I want to ask, what's the experience of inner speech? And so we're getting a little phenomenological here. Remember that Plato, Carruthers, Chomsky, and Wittgenstein seem to be saying you experience thought, that is concepts. But let's pay a little close attention to it, to this phenomenology. I hope you'll agree with me that actually it's primarily pronunciation, phonology or phonetics. It's in a language. We can ask, do you think in English or in French? Remember Peter Carruthers' son, I think in English. The inner speech has syllables, it has words, it has word order, verb agreement, maybe even intonation. These are all properties of pronunciation. They're not properties of thought. I should say, I think most of us have this impression that we're thinking that that we have verbal imagery and it comes in the form of language. There are people who evidently don't have this kind of imagery. My colleague Ted Gibson claims he has no inner speech. So there are individual differences. I hope if some of you don't experience internal speech, you'll tell me during the question period. Well, do you need inner speech for thinking? Could you think without language? Well, again, as I said earlier, the evidence suggests that other primates have concepts and that they think. They categorize things in the world, they draw inferences, they carry out plans, and sometimes it's rather abstract. It depends on notions like dominance and family, kinship, patterns of aggression, and things like that. And it's pretty complicated. But they can't have inner speech, of course. What language would the monkey's thought be in? Let's take another angle on the relation of thought and experience. What's different about the two ways of understanding the famous example, visiting relatives can be dangerous, which could either mean that you're visiting relatives, it's dangerous to you, or the relatives are visiting you and they're dangerous. These two interpretations sound the same. The difference in meaning is hidden, but we know it's there. Or what's the same about the English sentence, my dog is dead, and the German sentence, mein Hund ist tot? If you speak German and English, you just know that they mean the same thing. it can't be just that they invoke a common visual image either. For one thing, the visual image is too specific. The visualized dog has a particular color and is in a particular position. And second, the visual image isn't specific enough. There's nothing in it that encodes that the dog belongs to me. What these two sentences have in common is their meaning, the concept they express, but that isn't reflected in the form in which they reach awareness. What's happening when you have a tip of the tongue experience? There you have a concept, but it lacks any conscious form. So you're saying, what is that guy's name again? Or what the heck is the French word for mushroom? You can judge that this word isn't the one you want. You're going to say, it's not salacious. I think it starts with a K. It sounds like the da-da. You know when you've got it wrong, and you know when you've got it right. So you can have thought and meaning without accompanying verbal imagery, and you can have verbal imagery without associated meaning. Well, I haven't mentioned that yet. I'll come back to that. This leads me to posit what I'll call the unconscious meaning hypothesis. The experience of inner speech involves meaningful imagery of pronunciation. The meaning itself, its computational form, if you like, is not conscious. I have to add one caveat. There's a difference between hearing a pronunciation that's linked to a concept, say famous dentist, and one that's not linked to a concept that I promised you in the last slide. So if I say something like barada nikto, you're hearing pronunciation in both cases, but experiencing famous dentist, the utterance famous dentist, has a little extra something, not the whole form of the concept, but a feeling of meaningfulness, the ability to call up visual images and draw inferences. Barada nikto lacks this feeling. But where does this feeling of meaningfulness come from? It can't just come by magic. The brain has to compute it. The brain has to come up with the notion this is meaningful. Everything you're conscious of has to be coded somehow by the brain. So the feeling of meaningfulness has to be based, it could be based on the existence of a link between the pronunciation you hear, famous dentist, and the concept of famous dentist that you don't hear. When there isn't a link from pronunciation to a concept like barada nikto, you still hear a stretch of language, but it's made up of nonsense words. So you can think of the presence or absence of a link between the concept and the pronunciation as being detected by some sort of a monitor in the brain. There doesn't seem to be a good word for the output of this monitor's process. I'll call it a character tag. And the character tag adds a feeling to the pronunciation. It's meaningful versus meaningless. So if I go back to the unconscious meaning hypothesis, I want to focus on the term imagery. The experience of inner speech involves meaningful imagery of pronunciation. And it's an image rather than the experience of someone speaking. The speech sounds that involved can be exactly the same, but overt speech is sensed as being out there in the world, while inner speech is in your head. How come? How does this come about? Again, this difference cannot be a matter of magic. The conviction that it's in the world or in the head also has to be computed by the brain. This computation might be based on whether or not there's a link between an incoming sensory signal and the percept, in this case, pronunciation. So if there is a link, you experience the speeches out there in the world. If there's not such a link, you experience it as imagery. This would be another character tag. I'll call it external versus internal. Very strong feeling that it's out there in the world or not. But this combination of the two character tags gives us four sorts of experiences. So first, if a stretch of pronunciation is tagged as meaningful and external, we experience it as normal speech. If it's tagged as meaningful and internal, we experience it as inner speech. If it's tagged meaningless and external, it's someone uttering nonsense syllables. It's me saying barada nikto. If it's meaningless and internal, it's imagined nonsense words. So imagine barada nikto and hear it in your head. And that comes with meaningless and internal. So we can think of the experience of schizophrenics who hear voices. They're hearing stretches of meaningful pronunciation that are internally generated, but they're erroneously tagged as external. So the pronunciation sort of serves as a conscious, what we might call a handle for the unconscious concept. It gives the experience, the pronunciation gives the experience form, and the character tags are feelings that go with it. And together, these are the conscious vehicle of thought. I didn't make this analysis up just to analyze language. We can construct a similar analysis for visual consciousness. So I'll use the term visual surface for what's processed bottom up from the retina, what you might reproduce in a picture. And this contrasts with what you might call the visual meaning, your understanding of the actual shapes of objects, their full shape, even the parts you can't see, like their backs or their insides. The visual meaning is based on the visual surface, but it goes beyond it in the same ways the other stuff goes beyond the words in language. So here's a bookcase with a cat behind it. How does it look different from just a plain old bookcase? Well, they look the same, but they're understood differently. There's a different visual meaning. What about the famous duck rabbit? There are two ways of understanding it that present exactly the same signal to the eyes. Again, the same visual surface, but different visual understanding. This is just like the ambiguity of the sentence visiting relatives can be dangerous. And the character tags I propose for language pertain also to visual perception. So first, external versus internal is the distinction between visual perception versus visual imagery. Visual perception is driven by the eyes, and visual imagery is all generated from inside. Second would be meaningful versus meaningless. Here's a meaningless visual percept that becomes meaningful when you get it. Today, there's a Dalmatian dog in the middle of this nonsense, which I can't see it today. Maybe you can. If it's familiar, maybe in a better print, you can see it. But nothing in the sensory field has changed when you get it. And what about hallucinations? Well, these are experiences that are internally generated, but erroneously come with the character tag external. There's something you are perceiving out the world that your mind has generated internally. And dreams are experienced during dreaming, they're experienced as external, even though, again, they're generated internally. Well, here's going at this from a slightly different angle. How do we integrate these things? How do you talk about what you see? Well, again, there has to be a connection between linguistic meaning and visual meaning, not between the pronunciation and the surface. So when we talk about the cat, we don't usually talk about the way it looks from this angle in this light, referring to just the visible parts. Rather, we talk about the whole invariable cat, that is our visual understanding. And we don't just talk about the cat that we can see, we talk about the cat that's behind the bookcase. So let me review. What does the unconscious meaning hypothesis say about the nature of consciousness? Well, here's what I've said so far. The components of linguistic consciousness, if you're a philosopher, you'd say the linguistic qualia, are the pronunciation plus the associated character tags of meaningfulness, external versus internal, and others that I won't go into today, but they're in the book. Similarly, the components of visual consciousness are the visual surface plus associated character tags. It's the same tags, but accompanying altogether different content. This is really different from what conscious experience is generally made out to be. I want to mention three prestigious theories. The first one comes from, among other people, Bernard Bars and Stan DeHaan. And the idea is that consciousness is the basis of thought. And the answer is no, from this theory. What's conscious is pronunciation. Pronunciation is not the basis of thought. Meaning is the basis of thought, and meaning is not conscious. Second proposal comes from Christoph Koch, among other people. The idea is that consciousness is the mind's summary of everything it's processing, but especially the things that are causing difficulty in processing. That's wrong. According to the unconscious meaning hypothesis, pronunciation is linked to some of the concepts that the mind is processing, especially the character tags, but they're not conscious. Third view is coming from, among other people, Doug Hofstadter, where consciousness is the mind's model of itself. Well, no, that doesn't work either. The character tags do reflect the mind's monitoring what structures are linked up to what other structures. That's a very crude model of what's going on in the mind. The rest, the pronunciation, which is going on in consciousness, is only a model of speech sounds. It's not a model of the overall state of things in the mind. Why do all of these proposals about consciousness go off the rails? Well, if they talk about language at all, they typically talk about consciousness of language as a whole, and they fail to make the distinction between pronunciation and the structure of meaning. So they miss the fundamental observation that grounds the unconscious meaning hypothesis. And I think the same goes for vision. They typically miss the distinction between the visual surface and visual understanding. The unconscious meaning hypothesis comes out with such a different answer from these approaches because it examines the phenomenology more closely. It really looks closely to what's going on. And it does this in the context of a highly articulated theory of what kinds of data structures there are in the mind, including conceptual structure and phonology, and what kind of work each one does. Okay, so this completes the first part of my talk, if that wasn't enough. With all this in mind, right, I hope, I want to move on to the question of what's the nature of rational thinking. This may look totally unrelated to what I've been discussing, but I'm hoping I can show you that the unconscious meaning hypothesis plays a central role in answering it. So the ideal that goes back to Descartes' discourse on method is that rational thinking makes every step conscious and explicit with no hidden assumptions. So formal logic, as we know it today, I think is an attempt to achieve this ideal. It runs inferences on form alone with no mistakes, no reliance on gut feelings. This ideal, I think, is actually impossible, and I want to give you 5 reasons why. First one comes from Lewis Carroll in his little essay, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles. This is reprinted in Doug Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach. So it says, the idea is take a random syllogism, call it A. So primary premise, major premise, all houses on Golden Street are worth over $600,000. Minor premise, my house is a house on Golden Street. Conclusion, therefore, my house is worth over $600,000. What makes this a logical argument? Well, Aristotle says any argument of form B is valid. So major premise, all x's are y. Minor premise, z is an x. Conclusion, therefore, z is y. But how does that prove that A is valid? To prove that A is valid, you're tacitly invoking a hidden syllogism that I'll call C. Namely, all arguments of form B are valid. Argument A is an argument of form B. Therefore, argument A is valid. Uh-oh. How do we know that's valid? Well, there's another hidden syllogism. All arguments of form B are valid. C is an argument of form B. Therefore, C is valid. Well, you see where this is going. How do we know D is valid? And so on. In other words, there's an infinite regress. So that's what the tortoise told Achilles. Wittgenstein and Kant have another take on this problem. They want to say to see that syllogism A is an instance of syllogism B, you have to line up the steps of argument A with its prototype B. So you have to line up all houses on Golden Street in A with all X's in B. You have to line up $600,000 in A, lining up with Y and B. My house in A has to line up with Z and B. And the question that Wittgenstein and Kant ask is, how do you know you've applied the rules correctly? To know that we've done this right, we need a further rule that tells us how to line arguments up. but how do we know we've applied that correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So we have another infinite regress. Here's a third argument that I believe comes only from me. And it goes like this: by the reasoning so far, syllogism E ought to be valid. All houses on Golden Street are clumped together in one block. My house is a house on Golden Street. Therefore, my house is clumped together in one block. This is ridiculous. This is not a valid argument because it ends up with an ungrammatical conclusion. Well, what's the matter with it? Well, you might say clumped together has a different so-called logical form from worth $600,000. Clumped together has to apply to an aggregate, not a single object. But now you have to decide in a particular case whether this is a bona fide case of syllogism B, and that depends on its logical form, which is not out there on the surface. It's not present to consciousness, except for the feeling that something went wrong. So it's not rational. Here's another argument that you can't be totally rational. This one comes from Carl Lashley. He says, no activity of mind is ever conscious. So in validating a syllogism, we have no awareness of the mental process by which we get from lines 1 and 2 to line 3. We only have an intuitive sense of, yes, it follows, or no, it doesn't follow, as you may have sensed in the last example. Well, what's this intuitive sense? This is an unconscious computation that's performed on a meaning that results in a character tag that's associated with the sentence. The character tag says, yes, it's good, or no, it's not. Now, a fifth argument, finally going back to the unconscious meaning hypothesis, I concluded that the conscious language in which the thought process is made explicit consists only of pronunciation plus character tags. The actual work of inference, rational inference, is done unconsciously on the conceptual structure. So the big conclusion I draw from all of these examples is that rational thinking isn't an alternative to intuitive thinking. Rather, it depends on intuitive thinking, that is unconscious thought. At the same time, rational thinking is, as it were, clothed in language, which provides unconscious thinking with a conscious handle of pronunciation, so we know we're thinking. But what this means is that you can never be perfectly explicit because there are always intuitive steps in any act of reasoning. The best you can do is to be more explicit, to be sensitive to gaps, avoid confirmation bias, that is self-interest, judging true what you want to be true. And learning to do this, which we might call learning critical thinking, is like learning any skill or craft. It requires a combination of explicit explanation. Here's where you went wrong. This is a good argument, and so forth. And intuitive getting it. Oh, now I see how I'm supposed to reason. Well, would we really want to be perfectly rational anyway, like Descartes said? How much rational thinking do we actually do? How much do we simply take on faith? Do we seek rational explanations of everything in our lives? Well, do we care? Do we seek rational explanations of where our food comes from, how our computers and cell phones work, how our clothes and dishes and tools are manufactured? Whether you pick your friends rationally, you pick your profession rationally, and even in science, if you've chosen science, do we insist on reconstructing the foundations of our field all the time, or do we trust intuitively the received wisdom? In which case we can ask, which received wisdom should you trust? But if we can't be totally rational, we might ask, how does it help to think rationally using language on the occasions where we use something like rational language? So I'm going to go through 7 ways. That's a lot. So first, that the handle of pronunciation enables us to pay attention to the thought, to hold it in memory. We can retrieve it where needed. We can rehearse it. Second, a sentence expresses not just the content of a thought, but its character tags. It lets us make the character tags explicit and conscious. So if I say there's a cat on the mat, it is expressing the proposition, shall we say, that there's of a cat being on the mat, and a conviction, which is a character tag. That is, this sentence corresponds to reality. Similarly, there isn't a cat on the mat. There's a proposition of a cat being on the mat, and a character tag, dissent. It doesn't correspond. Or we can have the same proposition. There's a cat on the of a cat being on a map, and being non-committal, we don't know, and we can ask a question: is there a cat on the map? So you can attend to character tags as well, and you can express associated feelings explicitly. So you can ask yourself, is there really a cat on the mat? And language allows us to initiate a search for reasons or causes. So suppose we ask, why is there a cat on the mat? So we're committed to there a cat being on a mat, but we're non-committal about the reason. And I think why questions are really important. They're among the primary generators of scientific inquiry. Why does the sun do what it does? Why does the moon do what it does? Why does water flow, and so on? But it's also, and probably more important, it's why questions are generating inquiry into people's motives. So we can say, why did she say that? Why did he do that? And so on. That may actually be the real evolutionary source of why questions. Language allows us to make judgments of consistency among sentences, whether you think they're true or not. So we can say, if today is Tuesday, then tomorrow is Wednesday. And then you can manipulate these connections. You can say, if today is Tuesday, is tomorrow Thursday? And so on. And you can come up with an answer, no. And you can understand and maintain two thoughts as alternatives to each other explicitly in linguistic form. So you can say, either it's snowing or I'm dreaming. You can say, either John or Bill ate the leftover pasta. So these procedures enable us to examine our reasoning and break it into smaller steps. That's just what Descartes wanted rational thinking to do. I don't think we can do these manipulations with unconscious thoughts, and we can't represent these connections with visual imagery. So the phonological handles that are provided by language are a fantastic tool for enhancing and enriching thinking. In addition, I think conscious linguistic support is necessary in order to attain many important aspects of the human conceptual system. For example, the past, you have to tell people about it, you can't re-experience it. The number system, the counting sequence, the legal system, which depends on language, organized religion, rules of games, and concepts like finance and science that intrinsically involve numbers. I think much of the power of human thought then comes from linking conscious phonological structure to unconscious conceptual structure, where and it's at the latter where the actual processes of reasoning are being carried out. And in turn, an inference in conceptual structure, a new thought, can be made consciously manifest by linking it to a phonological form, which might be spoken or experienced as inner speech. Well, on the other hand, it's not all sweetness and light. Here are also some pitfalls of apparently rational thinking. First, having a word leads you to the assumption that there's a sharp category boundary, and opposite sides of the boundary call for sharply distinct responses. So we say, is it a dog or it's a wolf? Either it's a dog or it's not. But what about hybrids? Where do we put those? Or more disturbingly, either it's a murder or it's not. So that's what trials are about. Or is abortion a murder? If so, there are quite different consequences than if it's not. Or either it's genocide or it's not. Are 3 murders enough to count as genocide? No. Are 6 million? Yes. What about 2,000? What about 150,000? What about 1 million? Who's to say? That is, language tends to make categories too rigid and makes us not often recognize the in-between cases. Another problem is suppose there isn't a word for something, then it tends to be invisible. So if you believe that language is essential to thinking, then how do you characterize what monkeys do? You have no alternative but to shrug it off as mere instinct. But suppose we invent a new word for whatever it is that they do. Let's say they schmink. Then we have an alternative, and we can ask, does thinking, that is what we do, amount to schminking, what monkeys do, plus language? Or is thinking something else entirely from schminking. A third pitfall of apparently rational thought is that you can put words together with just an aura of meaningfulness. So here's a quote. I won't tell you who wrote it, but he says, "I don't think of consciousness as something that happens in us or to us, but as something that we achieve or something that we do through our action and interaction with the world around us." What is this? It sounds profound, but I have no idea what he's saying. Fourth pitfall is our reasoning is still only as good as the intuitive judgments that support the connections that say, yes, this follows, or no, it doesn't. We can't always tell if it's rational thinking, or is it just rationalizing? A symptom of rationalizing is when someone gives you different reasons all the time for the same conclusion. So an example from back at the time of the book is, pardon my politics, but if a government or a representative of the government says we should go to war because they harbor people who attacked us, we should go to war because they have weapons of mass destruction, we should go to war because they don't respect women's rights, because so on and so on. It's the same, you can see it's the same conclusion. That's what they want to be true, and offering different reasons every time. Or lowering taxes will create jobs, even though it hasn't created jobs. Lowering taxes will keep inflation down, even though it hasn't. Or government should be kept off our backs, but that's not how it's supposed to be when it comes to abortion and gay marriage, and so on. My point is that these all feel rational to at least some of their proponents. From the inside, we have no way to tell whether we ourselves are rationalizing or suffering from confirmation bias. The best we can do is to watch for cues from our physical and social environments that conflict with our convictions. Anyway, I think being alert to the possibility that you might be wrong at least keeps you modest. But that leads to a different sort of problem. How and when can we avoid the paralysis of self-doubt and move on? Well, that's an intuitive judgment too that we might have to entertain in the presence of our therapists. Well, on that sober note, let me summarize. Although we often experience our thought as inner speech, the speech is definitely not the thought. It's only the unconscious handle of the thought. The thought itself is unconscious. This ideal of rational thought, in which every step is made explicit, this comes from a widespread but incorrect conviction that thought is nothing but language. What we experience as rational thought rides on top of a robust base of intuitive thought. If you're a fan of Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, I'd suggest that his System 2 corresponds not to an entirely different system, but System 2 is linguistically based thought. So it's not a separate system, but rather the intuitive System 1 enhanced by language. And having conscious handles from language enhances thought vastly. But this doesn't excuse us from carefully examining our intuitions of rationality, which we can't make fully conscious. So are these good conclusions or bad ones? Are they welcome or unwelcome? I think you'll have to judge for yourself. For me, I just have to say, I have to think it's just a conclusion. I do like some things about it. In particular, it gives some room to validate a lot of aspects of our lives that are hard to justify rationally, that come from gut feelings, the value of tradition, such as it is, our love of the arts, including not just literature and music and art, but even things like good food and nicely decorated homes. And it validates some of the intuitions and feelings behind morality and religion, and the intuitions that lie behind good teaching. But that's a whole other discussion, I think, for, well, some philosophers to take up, I hope. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
And I will stop screen sharing, and there we are.
And I will stop recording.